Friends. So today our seminar on analysis of Supreme Court judgment on TDS on software and recent Telangana High Court judgment on Section 290 of New Benami Law. Important and landmark judgments, and to discuss we have a veteran and a very renowned Dr. Rakesh Gupta ji and Shri Ashwini Taneja ji as our guest speaker of the day. I would request our core member Bijal Doshi to please introduce our distinguished speaker of the day.
Thank you, sir, for giving me opportunity to introduce today's speaker. To start with, Advocate Rakesh Gupta. He secured merit positions in high school as well as intermediate and first rank in university in graduation. He is qualified as FCA, FCS, ICWA, MBA, LLB, LLM, as well as PhD. He was appointed member at Income Tax Appellate Tribunal at the age of 37. Currently, he is practicing as advocate and appearing in Income Tax Appellate Tribunal, High Courts, as well as Supreme Court of India. He co-authored books like Search, Seizure, and Assessment of Search Cases, and Taxation of Real Estate Developers and Joint Development Arrangement, which is published by Taxman. With this brief introduction, I would like to present the memento and receipt towards contribution to CABF Fund. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation. I request you to start the session.
Thank you. Sir, 1 minute. Sir, Bijal, you can introduce Ashwini sir also.
Sir. Speaker is Advocate Ashwini Taneja. He is former member of Income Tax Appellate Tribunal. He is Master in Law and also fellow member of Indian Council of Arbitration, New Delhi, Institute of Chartered Accountants, Company Secretary, as well as Cost Accountant. From year 1995 to 2007, he practiced as Chartered Accountant in various fields, after which he practiced as lawyer with the firm RRA Tax India. And in year 2015, he was elected as a member of Income Tax Appellate Tribunal and was posted at Mumbai bench. Currently, again, he is practicing as a lawyer with RRA Legal Delhi, specializing in area of anti-money laundering law, Benami law, Black Money Act, SIFO, and income tax. Good number of landmark cases argued by him before different courts or authored by him at tribunal have been published in leading tax journal of the country. With this brief introduction, I would like to present memento and receipt towards contribution to CABF Fund. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation. I request you to start the session.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bijal, for having spoken so nicely about us. Convener, Deputy Convener, and other office bearers of Borivali chapter, CPE, Study Circle of the Institute of Chartered Accountants. As Nilesh has said, and very rightly so, that the time running is very tough. But I believe that it is somewhat better in your part of the country. But then the situation in Delhi and around is quite disheartening. And therefore, in such situations, when such kind of situation is prevalent here, the obvious question comes, if at all, I mean, there should be, such programs or the webinars. But I think when we are surrounded by the despondency and the negativism, these webinars maybe in a small measure at least act as a catalyst to spread some element of positivity, and therefore I must compliment the convener and other office bearers of your study circle for organizing this webinar. The topic, which has been assigned to me, as Bijal has also spoken, the TDS on software royalty, the decision rendered by the Supreme Court. This is one of the hotly contested matter, spanning almost for more than 2 decades, involving more than 100 taxpayers as the litigating parties directly, and innumerable number of other taxpayers who are languishing at some stage of the appellate fora, and with approximately 40 to 50,000 crores of the tax involved in such dispute. So this decision, which has been rendered by the Supreme Court, is a very hard earned, much toiled decision. But then who knows that this much toiled one and the hard earned this fruit, now whether or lest should be taken away by some retrospective amendment. Our memories when Vodafone decisions came, I mean, is not very stale. It is fresh in our memory. And therefore, we all are keeping fingers crossed as to whether the government accepts this decision of the Supreme Court in right earnest, and more particularly when the coffers of the government are not as they ought to be, having regard to this pandemic situation. But one thing is clear, that we have got a very peculiar legal system. And in a legal system, when the justice comes as late as 20 years after, then it calls for introspection on everybody's part, even me, you and I, and everybody will have to introspect. So we have got a very peculiar legal system where the delay in most of the cases, by the time it comes out from the highest court of the land, inevitable. I remember when I was posted as member Income Tax Appellate Tribunal in Hyderabad, and that was the year 2000. Now one case came before me. I was part of the division bench. One case came before me, and that case was relating to an assessment year, and it was in respect of the wealth tax, even much before my date of birth. It was some wealth tax case of Nizam's family, and probably the assessment year involved was 1959-60. So and it was not disposed. I mean, by the time I left tribunal, I do not know the position as of now, but then that is a very strong pointer as to what kind of system do we have. And that is why I always say that our system does not evoke even the minimal confidence. And particularly that confidence level in multinational companies who come to India to do business, I mean, is very disappointingly very low. And they are not able to fathom, visualize, or appreciate or digest as to why can there be so much delay in the dispensation of justice. Irrespective of the amount of your attempt to make them understand and appreciate the situation, I mean, they say, I mean, what kind of, why is there delay? Why there are dates after dates? But then we have got our own system, and for which I mean, not one organ or one facet or one aspect or one segment can be found fault with. And this is a systemic failure, and which calls for an overhaul kind of a situation. Now, I do not know how many of you may be aware that one of the litigating parties before the Supreme Court was Samsung. They were appellant before the Supreme Court. Then Vivad se Vishwas scheme came, and they applied for the Vivad se Vishwas scheme's tax dispute settlement petitions under that Vivad se Vishwas Act. when their matter was being heard before the Supreme Court. So you can very well, but of course, I mean, we cannot continue, I mean, to keep on complaining, because of late some concrete measures have been taken for reducing the litigation by introduction of the scheme like Vivad Se Vishwas scheme, and by increasing the threshold in the tax amounts involved wherever the department wanted to prefer appeals before the various appellate forums. And with this, the burden on the litigation system is sought to be lowered down. So now coming to this decision of the Supreme Court, and the title of which is based upon one of the litigating parties. So there were more than 100 odd cases, some by the taxpayers, primarily against the orders of the Karnataka High Court, who had taken consistent view that the payments made by the resident to the non-resident software suppliers, I mean, would constitute royalty, and which proposition, I mean, was upheld by Karnataka High Court. So some of the litigating parties, some of the SSEs were against the Karnataka High Court's decisions. They were appellant before the Supreme Court, whereas the Delhi High Court, in a series of decisions, consistently held otherwise. And therefore, the Income Tax Department was the appellant before the High Court. The authority for advance rulings, there were, I mean, mixed kind of rulings. Some were adverse to the SSEs, some were in favor of the SSEs, and therefore, I mean, all those were appellants before, wherever the aggrieved parties were before the Supreme Court. So the common issue which was before the Honorable Supreme Court was as to whether and as to what is the nature of this payment made by the resident taxpayers towards the purchase of the software, and whether this payment which is remitted outside India for purchase of the software or towards the software, now whether would constitute royalty and was thus exigible to tax, and in certain cases which were before the Supreme Court, whether the tax was required to be withheld by them under section 195. So the Supreme Court now segregated these cases for the sake of an effective and efficient discussion into 4 parts, though the issue involved even all these 4 categories of cases was one, as to whether the payment would constitute royalty exigible to tax in India. But then, for the sake of a better appreciation, I mean, Honorable Supreme Court categorized these cases. Number 1, where the software supplier was non-resident and the end user was the resident. The second situation was where, of course, the software supplier was non-resident, and non-resident software supplier supplied the software to the resident distributors, and that resident distributors in turn were to sell it to resident end users. And the third categories of cases were there where the non-resident software suppliers were there. At the same time, even the distributors were also the non-resident, and those non-resident distributors were to supply the softwares to the resident distributors or directly to the end users. And the fourth category of cases were those cases where the software was bundled. Software was an integral part of that equipment, and that equipment along with that software which was bundled with that equipment was to be sold to the end user. Supreme Court, when it started writing its decision, as Ashwini ji and those who appear before the courts, I mean, would vouch that even when we have to argue one case, we weave our case, we build up our case right from the word go. And similarly, when it comes to the writing the order, then also the court weaves its order. And therefore, the court went by extracting section 4 and both subsections of 4, 4.1 and 4.2, then section 5, then section 6, section 9, section 90, and section 195. And this much settled position was very lucidly spelled out by their lordships in the beginning paras, in the starting paras of this decision. And I think, though I said a little while ago that the court has to weave, has to start right from the word go as to how the position of law, which will be relevant for the later discussion in the later part of the order. But then in this case, it became all the more necessary because a preliminary objection was raised on behalf of the Union of India or on behalf of the Tax Department by the Additional Solicitor General. And that preliminary objection which was made, or a preliminary argument which was made, and that too by relying upon a decision of Supreme Court in the case of Pilcom, that under section 195, when it comes to the deduction of withholding of the tax by the resident taxpayer, then at that stage, the resident taxpayer is not supposed to look towards the provision of the double taxation avoidance agreement. And for that, the Additional Solicitor General tried to draw a distinction between the word payer appearing in section 195 and the word SSE as defined under section 2 clause 7. And thereby this argument was pressed based upon the decision of the Supreme Court in the case of Pilcom that at the stage of withholding of the tax, the payer is not supposed, payer is not required, the payer is not obliged to look at the provisions of the treaty. He must concentrate and look towards only the domestic provisions of law. And if that payment now can be covered within the net of income under the domestic provisions, therefore the applicable tax rate should be deducted. But then the Supreme Court, as I said a little while ago, then discussed the charging section with reference to the residency rules and said that the taxability of an income in India is dependent upon the residency rules which are there under section 6. Section 4 is the charging section. And when an income is chargeable to tax as per section 4 subsection 1, then that tax has to be paid either in advance or by way of withholding of tax or the deduction of tax at source. Then the Supreme Court went on section 5 on the scope of the total income, particularly subsection 2 of section 5, which was relevant for the subject, that as to what is the scope of total income in case of the non-resident SSEs, non-resident persons. And the Supreme Court, as per the language of section 5.2, said that all income from whatever source accruing or arising or receiving or being received or deemed to be received by the non-resident now are chargeable to tax in the hands of the non-resident. Then section 9, certain incomes are deemed to accrue or arise in India even if they may not actually arise or accrue in India, but then by virtue of some fiction which is there under section 9 of various categories of the income. And then the court said that all these provisions of section 4 or section 5 are subject to the provisions or other provisions of this act. And therefore, when section 4 and section 5 are subject to the other provisions of the act, therefore the court said that how can section 90 be ignored? Because under section 90, subsection 2, the central government may enter into the agreement with the government of a foreign country. And then any provision of the Income Tax Act and the provisions of the Double Taxation Avoidance Agreement, whichever is more beneficial in case of a taxpayer, I mean, that will be applicable. And so court said that when section 4 charging section, section 5 scope of total income are subject to the other provisions of the act, meaning thereby that section 90 is not alien to section 4 and section 5. Therefore, to say that for the purpose of withholding tax under section 195, I mean the assessee or the payer or the withholder or the tax deductor, I mean, should turn its eyes away from the charging provisions under the Income Tax Act is too much to argue. Honorable Court said that section 195 may be a machinery provision, but then it is inextricably or intricately linked with section 9 and section 4 and section 5. Court said that the legislature has used the expressions some chargeable to tax under section 195, meaning thereby that unless the amount which is to be remitted outside India is not a sum which is chargeable to tax under the provisions of either the Income Tax Act read with the treaty provisions, till then there is no obligation to withhold the tax. And therefore this expression, though this position was always like this, and Supreme Court relied upon its own decisions in the case of GE Technologies, and then Supreme Court said that the pressing by the additional Solicitor General the decision of this court in Pilcom is misplaced in as much as the Pilcom's decision was in respect of section 194 capital E, and which was one of the provisions of chapter 17B, in which the deduction was not linked with the sum chargeable to tax under the provisions of law. Because section 194E, the court said, was in respect of the tax deduction at source out of income which was payable to non-resident sports person, including the athlete and non-resident sports association. And therefore, for the purpose of deduction of tax at source under section 194E, or for that matter, in respect of other sections of this genre, the Supreme Court said that at that stage, it is not permissible in law for the tax deductor to see whether this amount is chargeable to tax in the hands of that payee. And therefore, because of the specific expression which has been used by the legislature in section 195, that it should be a sum chargeable to tax in India, and therefore the decision of Pilcom, which was in the context of section 194E under chapter 17B, and therefore, I mean, both cannot be equated, and therefore the Supreme Court repelled this argument, this objection of the additional Solicitor General based upon the Pilcom Limited, that the tax deductor or the tax deductor or the amount or the person who is to remit that amount, I mean, should not be concerned with the Double Taxation Avoidance Agreement. The court repelled that argument. Court referred and relied upon the decision of Azadi Bachao Andolan. I mean, though this position of law was more than well settled on earlier occasions, but then as a litigating counsel, I can say before the High Court and before the Supreme Court, yes, before the tribunal many times we say, okay, this case is covered, the tribunal says, okay, it's covered. But then I have seen before the High Court and before the Supreme Court, even if some matters may appear to be covered, but then genuine attempts are made by the litigating parties to find some gaps or holes or some inconsistencies or some grounds so that the court may revisit its earlier decisions. And instances are not uncommon where, I mean, the courts have revisited those decisions and have taken, I mean, different view depending upon the constitution of the bench strength. So Azadi Bachao Andolan was relied upon, and this principle was well initiated in the decision. And then board's own circular number 333 dated 3rd of April 1982, in which it was an accepted positions on the part of the board that when there is inconsistency between the provisions of the Income Tax Act and the provisions of the Double Taxation Avoidance Agreement, then that provision which is more beneficial to the taxpayer has to be accepted and was relied upon. And therefore, the primacy of the treaty or the supremacy of the treaty over the domestic law was upheld, was reiterated by the Supreme Court. And one of the arguments taken by the court in order to demolish this argument of learned Additional Solicitor General of India that the payer should not be concerned with the treaty provisions at the time of withholding the tax was repelled by finding out this fallacy, that what kind of a situation would it emerge in case, I mean, we come to agree as to what learned Additional Solicitor General has argued. Either if the tax is deducted at source under the domestic law, and which of course is the rate which is higher than the treaty rate, and then later on, by virtue of the application of the treaty rate, the refund has to result. Then what is the point? That is what the Supreme Court, I mean, dug out this ostensible fallacy, the arguments of the learned Additional Solicitor General. So this was the first position taken by the Supreme Court in the matter of law. The second situation, I mean, which was there, the second aspect, I would say, which was there before the Supreme Court was to determine the nature of the payment made for the computer software in order to find out whether such payment was royalty, was chargeable income to tax, and this royalty was on account of the transfer of copyright, because now this word copyright, I mean, has not been defined anywhere. Therefore, the Supreme Court adverted to explanation 4 to section 90. And that explanation 4 to section 90 says that if any word or term is not defined in the treaty, then the definition of that term, which is there in the domestic law, I mean, will have the field. Similarly, Article 3, Subarticle 2 of the Double Taxation Avoidance Agreement was also referred, and which also said that in case some term is not defined in the treaty but then is defined in the domestic law, I mean, that has to be taken note of and that has to be considered. So under the domestic law, by virtue of explanation 4 to section 90, by virtue of Article 3, Subarticle 2 of the DTAA, the court was to find out whether the word copyright has been defined under the domestic law or not. So what to say of the domestic law? It was neither in the treaty nor in the domestic law. Therefore, in the absence of the meaning given to this word of copyright, which was very material in the context of the software, it was essential for the Supreme Court to find out the meaning of the word copyright, and therefore Honorable Supreme Court said that since in India nobody gets the copyright, otherwise then in accordance with the provisions of the Indian Copyright Act, and therefore court said then we would refer Indian Copyrights Act. And this has been so mentioned in section 16 of the Indian Copyright Act also, which says that nobody in India would get the copyright otherwise than in accordance with the provisions of the Indian Copyrights Act. So Honorable Supreme Court then referred in order to find out as to whether there is any definition of copyright under the Indian Copyright Act. Having not so found any definition under the Indian Copyright Act, even to this word of copyright, then the Supreme Court turned to section 14 of the Indian Copyright Act. because section 14 of the Indian Copyrights Act now tells by virtue of two clauses, small a and small b, as to when can it be said that there is a copyright. Though the word copyright has not been defined under the definition clauses, but then it has been given a meaning under section 14 of the Indian Copyright to say that copyright is an exclusive right. This is very important. It's an exclusive right to do or authorize doing any of the following acts. There are 6 or 7 acts which have been mentioned. That if there is an exclusive right to do or authority to do any of those acts in respect of a work, and the work has been defined under section 2 clause O of the Indian Copyrights Act to mean literary, scientific, and that work, it says literary work includes computer software. So section 14 of the Indian Copyrights Act says that when there is an exclusive right to do or authority to do any of these acts which are listed there in respect of a work, namely in case of a literary work, and computer is part of the literary work, computer software is part of the literary work, and 1 or 2 acts which are mentioned in section 14 clause A, though it is not applicable in case of the computer software. Now it says to reproduce the work, to issue copies of the work to the public, to make adaptation of the work, to make any adaptation of the work, and there are, but then since these 3 were relevant for the purpose of discussion. But then clause A says that in respect of any work other than computer software. So A may not be relevant as of now, but then clause B of section 14. Now it says that first of all those things which are mentioned in clause A now would apply in case of software also. And then said that it would include even to sell or give on commercial rental or offer for sale or for commercial rental any copy of the computer program. So that will also be treated as copyright. So if somebody reads this in a cursory manner, then one may be constrained to think that even the sale of a software, computer software, I mean, would be as good as the copyright, because it says that to sell or give on commercial rental or offer for sale or for commercial rentals any copy of the computer program. But then thereafter, in the same breath, the Supreme Court noticed and referred and then dealt in a very exhaustive manner to one amendment which was made in the Indian Copyrights Act in section 14 small b, now which was omitted by the amendment to give a true and correct meaning of the word copyright in respect of the computer software. And that phrase which was deleted by the legislature was that regardless of whether such copy has been sold or given on hire on earlier occasions. So the Supreme Court said when this phrase was earlier there and which was deleted by the legislature in its wisdom from the year 1999. Therefore, Supreme Court said that the copyright can be there only with reference to the first sale. And in respect of the subsequent sale of the computer software, there will not be any copyright. So Supreme Court, by taking note of this amendment in the Copyrights Act, in the definition or in section 14 small b, then deciphered, and by applying the principle which is called the doctrine of the first sale, or by saying it as the principle of exhaustion, now deciphered that the copyright of the owner in a computer software ends with the first sale and is not extended in respect of the subsequent sale. This is a very important proposition which has been discovered by Supreme Court, but of course on the basis of the arguments advanced by Mr. Datar, who represented the case of Samsung, is that the doctrine of first sale, so the copyright. So like I have written a book on search and seizure, and I have given the right to copy to the taxman. So my giving this right to copy to the taxman is the copyright which I am transferring. But then thereafter, if taxman now appoints the distributors for selling the copies, then at that stage there is no involvement of the transfer of copyright from taxman to, because the taxman, I mean, because that was the case of subsequent sale. So the right of the owner, the copyright of the owner ends with the first sale. So when I made sale to taxman in respect of my work, so my copyright ended at the stage of the first sale, and it cannot be said to be extended in respect of the subsequent sale. Therefore, the distribution rights simpliciter, because now taxman, when appoints a distributor to distribute that book to various booksellers or to the end users, now there is no right. It is a simple distribution right. It is a distribution right simpliciter. There is no right to make reproduction, because the Supreme Court has said that the right to reproduce, right to reverse engineering, right to modify, right to adapt. Now these are such important rights which are central to that copyright. And since in the distribution rights simpliciter, there is no right to re-engineer, there is no right to modify, there is no right to reproduce, and therefore it would not constitute transfer of copyright, and hence payment against such right cannot be termed as royalty. And therefore the Supreme Court said that the sale of shrink-wrapped software, because in most of the cases the issue was with respect to the shrink-wrapped software. So the Supreme Court, by relying upon the Tata Consultancy Services decision, said that when a shrink-wrapped software is sold or is transferred, then it is nothing more than mere sale of the goods, and payment against such sale cannot be termed as payment towards royalty. So this was the second proposition, I mean, which was held by the Supreme Court. Now, after laying down these principles of law based upon a very wonderful analysis of the provisions of the Indian Copyright Act, then the Supreme Court took upon the task of analyzing the end user's license agreement in order to see whether there is any transfer of such kind of rights which can be said to be the transfer of copyright. On sample basis, of course. So end user's license agreements clauses were considered by the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court said and found that none of the rights given under these agreements were exclusive license or exclusive right, and exclusivity is also one of the important feature of the copyright. So there was non-exclusive transfer, there was non-exclusive license, there was absence of exclusivity, and even the distribution right was riddled with so many riders, with so many restrictions. And therefore the Supreme Court said that in these end users license agreements, there are no such rights which are enshrined in section 14 small a and small b of the Indian Copyrights Act, and therefore none of these agreements can be said to be an agreement for transferring the copyright, because there was no right to reproduce, there was no right to re-engineering, there was no right to remodify, and therefore the absence of elements of section 14 small a and small b of the Indian Copyrights Act now would make all these end users license agreements as the agreement for a simple distribution, and therefore cannot be said to be these agreements cannot be said to be the agreements for transferring copyright. So Supreme Court at this stage decided this thing categorically in the light of the law as expounded on the basis of the Indian Copyrights Act, and having regard to the specific clauses of end users license agreements, that there was no transfer of copyright in the software, and since there was no transfer of copyright in the software, therefore the definition of royalty in the treaty, which is narrower than the definition which has been expanded in section 9 under the domestic law, I mean the treaty definition would apply, and therefore there was no royalty. There was no royalty, and therefore as per the treaty, I mean nothing was exigible to tax. Honorable Court's attention was drawn to explanation 4 to section 9 also, now which was added by the Finance Act 2012, and that too with a retrospective effect on 1st April 1976, and then sought to argue and sought to be argued upon that in the light of this explanation 4 to section 9, which has been given the retrospective effect by the legislature, now even the transfer of computer program now should itself be treated as a transfer of the copyright, or should be treated as or should come within the definition of royalty. Now this argument was repelled by Supreme Court by saying that merely because the legislature has said that this is retrospective, this provision is clarificatory, it has to come into effect from such and such date, now does not bind the court, I mean to agree. If it can be seen, or it can be shown, or it can be demonstrated that this declaration by the legislature that this explanation has been added with retrospective effect is really retrospective in nature, then the court would not condone this. And if you remember, now many times when the legislature says a particular provision is to come into effect with prospective, then also the courts have said that in certain situations the courts can give even such prospective provisions to have the retrospective effect. If you remember, in case of section 43B, on the basis of the Allied Motors, the Supreme Court said, or for that matter in case of the employers' contributions of the ESI and PF under section 43B, now legislature said that they will come into effect from a prospective date, but then the court said these provisions have been enacted with a view to avoid a hardship, and therefore they are curative in nature, and therefore these provisions, even if the legislature says will come into effect from a prospective date, but then we will hold them to have come into with retrospective effect. And similarly, in case of this explanation 4, when the converse was the argument on behalf of the Union of India, for that matter, or on behalf of the Tax Department, then the court said that the computer software itself has been brought into section 9 from 1991. Now, computer software itself has been brought under the Indian Copyright Act in 1994. Therefore, how can you say that this was always intended from 1st April 1976 to bring within it, to bring computer software within its scope? So the court found that something, I mean, which itself has come on the horizon in the year 1991 under section 9 itself, or for that matter under Indian Copyright Act in 1994, and then to say that the legislature always meant to have brought computer software right from 1st April 1976 is something which did not find favor from the court, and therefore the court held that this explanation 4 at best is prospective and cannot be given the retrospective effect. And therefore the courts have said that you may have used the words for removal of doubts, you may have used the words which may convey that you wanted to clarify, but then that by itself is not enough, and we as the courts have to take cognizance of all attendant factors, and having regard to those attendant factors, this explanation 4 was found to have prospective effect, not retrospective effect. Then came the next, though the Supreme Court could have stopped at this stage, because the issue which was involved before the Supreme Court was very well discussed and decided, and it would have been final at this stage. But then the Supreme Court went further, because most of the cases were in respect of 195, as the payers did not withhold a tax before remitting the money outside India, and therefore for not withholding the tax they were treated as assessed in default under section 201, and they were made to wear the shoes of the non-resident assessees and cough out the amount of tax and then interest under section 2011 capital A. But then when the Supreme Court held explanation 4 to have the prospective effect, then obviously based upon explanation 4, there could not be any tax liability in the past. There could have been no liability of TDS in the past for all the more reason because that explanation itself was brought in 2012, and even if that explanation had been given retrospective effect, but then for the purpose of deducting or withholding the tax in years earlier than 2012, the SSEs could not have anticipated this explanations, that this explanation will come in 2012 with a retrospective effect, fastening the tax liability, and therefore they ought to have deducted that time when explanation 4 was not there. So court said, now the law cannot expect you to do something which is impossible, which is incapable of being complied with. And therefore, the theory of impossibility of performance or compliance of a provision which was not there, was pressed by the court, and on that score also, those who did not withhold the tax, were found more than justified in the absence of any provisions obliging them to withhold. Then the Supreme Court made a very important observations regarding the significance and the persuasive value of the OECD commentary. Though the decision of the Supreme Court was on its own legs, even without this observations that the OECD commentary or positions OECD commentary, have got the persuasive force. But then the court said that the commentary, OECD commentary, irrespective of a position taken by a member country, now can be taken to be having a persuasive force. India has taken a position with respect to the royalty on computer software. But then the court said that unless that position has been accepted by both the countries by making appropriate amendment in the treaty, now one member country by taking a position or by making an amendment in the domestic law now cannot be said to be having any binding effect insofar as the transactions between these two countries are concerned, merely for the reason that one of the two countries has taken a particular position. Because after all, these treaties are the bilateral instruments. So unless that position taken by one of the parties has been accepted by the other, has been made part of the treaty, I mean, cannot be taken cognizance of. Definitely the treaties have to be interpreted based upon the intentions of the parties, but then the intentions of both the parties. And therefore, this observation of the Supreme Court that OECD commentaries are significant and have got the persuasive force. Now, even in the law of stare decisis, I mean, we see and we know and we have seen and we keep on seeing every day that we have got certain rules of precedence. Certain decisions from a court other than the jurisdictional high court, and the courts have said that they have got the strong persuasive force. And OECD commentary in the same sense now has been accorded by this decision to be having a persuasive force. It may not be binding on the courts, it may not be binding, but then definitely if OECD has taken a particular position, then that can at best be taken a view from an expert, and therefore if significance is attached to that commentary or some persuasive value is assigned or accorded by the Supreme Court, then of course it has to be taken to the logical end. Thereafter, Supreme Court discussed about the AAR decision. AAR decisions were on both sides. And while discussing one AAR decision which was adverse to the SSE in the case of Citrax, the Supreme Court said that AAR went wrong and has erred in law by not appreciating the distinction and difference between the copyright and the copyrighted article. Then Supreme Court discussed and dissented from the decisions given by the Karnataka High Court, and found that there was some apparent fallacy, and the stand taken by Karnataka High Court was against section 51 and 52 of the Indian Copyrights Act, and a mere authority to the end user to upload the software on his computer cannot be said to be the infringement of copyright, and cannot be said to be giving a copyright to the end user merely by that reason or for that reason. The decision of the Delhi High Court in Nokia, in Infrasoft, in Ericsson, in ZTE, they were approved, and that too by making discussions with respect to each of these decisions. And therefore, the Supreme Court now put to rest that raging controversy as to whether these payments on account of the software did constitute royalty and were thus chargeable tax in India, and therefore these non-residents were required to tax on it. Now, of course, after this decision of the Supreme Court, the government may explore the possibility of, in applicable cases, of course, levying or imposing the equalization levy, because the scope of the equalization levy has been expanded. But another situation which is there, or the position which these taxpayers now will have to see that those who were directly involved in this dispute before the Supreme Court, the taxes having been paid by them, they will get the refund. Those who are into the various stages of litigation before various forums, by pressing these decisions, of course, those decisions will be in their favor, and in that situations, they will be entitled to seek the refund. But then where the SSEs have not gone in for further litigations and have sought to give quietus to this litigation by paying and not agitating in the form of any appeal. Now, for them, it will be a difficult task, because the limitations will keep on staring at their face. how do or how can they claim the refund because they have not litigated? And that is why many times I always say that each adverse order, should be kept alive, and which the importance of which can very well be vouched by this fact that if a particular adverse order had not been kept alive by way of litigations, then that person would not have gone in for Vivad se Vishwas scheme. And similarly, if a person who has not appealed against an adverse order and has accepted the order at some stage, now may find it difficult because of the limitations set in, to seek refund. There may be a case which can be made out by seeking condonation of delay, by moving petition under section 264, or depending upon as to at which stage he has accepted that, or by filing a writ before the High Court by confessing and pleading that there was no lack of diligence on his part, there was a bona fide, and that depends upon, because condonation of delay also itself is a subject on which a lot of energy will have to be spent. So friends, now this is all just I wanted to say and discuss about this Supreme Court's decision on engineering analysis, the Center of Excellence. I thank you for the kind niceties which have been extended to me. Thank you from the core of my heart.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, we have a few questions. I think we can take the questions.
We can take after Ashwini speaks, because let me have some water also.
Okay.
Okay.
Fine.
I am there. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Ashwini, sir. Now the platform is yours.
Thank you, Nilesh ji. Thank you, Vijal, for the kind words you had spoken. Sikandar ji and our Vipin Bhai Sahab has also joined. And my senior partner, Mr. Amit Khemka, and who is specialized in prosecution of economic offences, especially Benami law and PMLA, has consented on a very short notice to join because his mother was not feeling good. So I requested him, if you can spare 30 minutes, he was kind enough. And I would pay special thanks to my partner, Dr. Rakesh Gupta, whom I requested a few days back that I have a special affection for people of Mumbai because I was there for 2 years, and the kind of love everybody in Mumbai gave to me, whatever little I can pay back by sharing my thoughts, I derive pleasure. So I requested Dr. Gupta that this is a topic on which you have a very good grip. So if you could kindly throw some light on this topic. So he consented. I am really thankful to Dr. Gupta, and thankful to the organizers that despite this tough time, you are keeping the rhythm of the life alive, keeping the people away from the depression, which is really eating, our peace and harmony. Kudos to you people. That's in these tough times also you are working and for the cause of the profession. Before I come back to the issue of issues which we are discussed Benami on with regard to Benami. In fact, this topic on which Dr. Saab has wonderfully summed up. In fact, the first brush on any ticklish topic I had while I was posted in Mumbai at Income Tax Appellate Tribunal was this topic only. And as the luck would have it, the things happened like that. What happened that there were some contradictory, conflicting decisions. Coming from Mumbai only. Third member said this, then division bench said this, the single member bench said this. So probably in the name of Reliance Infocom or some other judgments were there. 2-3 judgments were there. So I was there in 2015-16. So there was some kind of, deadlock. So on this topic, the issues were being compiled and no judgments was being passed by any of the benches. Bench K and J and K used to work on this international tax matter. So nothing was happening. So one day, one matter came before us, wherein the issue was not of the software, but of sale of the equipment, and the equipment was having embedded software. So I talked to my senior colleague in the bench and I said, this is the time I want to break open that ice and let us start deciding the issues one way or the other. Only then it will reach to Supreme Court. Otherwise, there will be deadlock and deadlock only. And my senior, it was probably Mr. Sakshaji Day or Mr. Sanjay Garg or Mr. Amit Khemka, Mr. Amit Shukla, they were very, very helpful and very wise. So it was told to me, yes, Ashwini, if you want to take the initiative, let us do it. So then we analyzed, and after a gap of 2-3 years, we could break the ice. And then first judgment came in the name of Galatea, G-A-L-A-T-E-A. It was an Israeli company, and it was selling some medical equipment in which some softwares were embedded. And after that, one after another, then Gemini and many other judgments came one after another. Sanjay Garg ji also wrote good judgments. Shukla ji also wrote good judgments, and that is how it happened. And I'm really very thankful and very pleased to know that Honorable Supreme Court has really put the controversy on rest, and the views which has been taken by Honorable Supreme Court are, I mean, our views have been very kindly accepted. The view which was taken in 2016 or so in the Mumbai Tribunal, I mean, we choose to follow the judgment which were given by Honorable Delhi High Court. So, I mean, it gives me a pleasure to share all those moments. Coming back to issues with regard to Benami, Amit Khemka ji and I, we have been working extensively along with the inputs from Dr. Gupta on the analysis of the ticklish issues which we are facing under Benami law. As you all know, that this is a new law, and its implementation with effect from 1/11/2016, suddenly changing the then existing law, which was there since September 1988, put many people into trouble. It came as a bolt from the blue, because, as you know, friends, that Benami law has been, in the blood of the people here. It has been a customary practice. I would not say always for bad reasons. There were some good reasons, there were some genuine reasons, there may be some bad reasons, there may be some violative reasons, but there have been some customary practices also. So for bad reasons or for good reasons, people were affected very badly. And also because of the fact that the law has been drafted in a highly vague manner, it is being implemented in more vague manner. There is lack of proper guidance, lack of proper training. There is lack of clarity on the policy framework of the government. Statement of objectives absolutely missing. And on the top of it, the report of the Law Commission, which was, given in the chairmanship of Mr. Virappa Moily, wherein they said if this law is implemented in this manner, this report was given in 2013 or 14. So if the law is given in this manner, in this shape, then there will be chaos, human cry all over the country. More than 50% of the rural India as well as urban India may be treated as Benami. So drastic amendments may be needed. It should not be implemented as it is. But despite that, there was indeed some urgent need. And in the wisdom of the government, the law was implemented as it is after making minor tweaking, which is not relevant to be mentioned even, very negligible. So that is why we are facing that, the business is also getting affected adversely because people were not ready for it. We are not able to understand the precise scope and meaning. The initiating officers who are the enforcement agencies are also do not have the clarity that what to do, what to leave, and whatever they have to do, how to do, in what manner, how the provisional attachment orders are to be passed, what kind of opportunities are to be given, how the provisions of Indian Evidence Act have to be kept in mind, to what extent, because this provision says, the law says, as per their understanding, that this law is overriding any other law and the provisions of any other law. So to what extent the final principles of, well-established principles of Indian Evidence Act or principle of natural justice, including the opportunity of cross-examination, including the opportunity of inspection of file, including the mandatory requirement of recording of reasons, including the mandatory requirement of providing the copy of the reasons, including the mandatory requirement of recording the satisfaction by the approving authority and providing its copy to the noticee, and all these things, to what extent they are applicable here. There is a self-created confusion, I would say. Otherwise, our constitutional framework is very clear. Every law, whatever law comes in our country, it has to function within the constitutional framework. But somehow the feeling is coming as if this law is totally different. Maybe, has the potential to disregard sometimes the finer principles of our constitution, the well-established, ethos of our constitution. That is how it is being implemented in some of the cases. So, in the middle of all those chaos, if a judgment comes which is throwing some light, it is like giving oxygen to the person who is asking for few drops of breath. So that is why when I was talking to Nilesh Bhai and Kinjal Shah Bhai, so they said ki if any development is there from any High Court, we would like to discuss with regard to Benami law. So recently we had contested one matter from before Honorable Telangana High Court, in which the burning issue was with regard to the interpretation and scope of section 2(9)(d) of the PBPT Act. And Honorable High Court has given its judgment, which I will discuss with you. Why I have emphasized today on 2(9)d, why not on A, B or C? Though I will discuss A, B or C also for the sake of completeness, but D is going to have a very, very sweeping effect, because the way clause G has been worded, probably it is going behind even the intention of the subject, intention of the law. Probably they did not think what kind of expressions have been used by the legislature while drafting this law, which will definitely cause avoidable hardship to the people who will be covered under the clutches of this law. So friends, there is one way that I straight away come to the judgment which is given by Honorable Telangana High Court, and the other way would be that since we have sufficient time, let me take you to brief introduction and brief background about the Benami law, how it has been, how the provisions have been drafted, how it has been brought out, what are the burning issues. Then we will briefly touch those issues, and we will definitely keep a focus on the main burning issue, that is 2(9)d, and how Honorable High Court has touched upon the issue of 2(9)d, and how it has touched upon other issues also, which I mentioned short while ago, that is recording of reasons, Indian Evidence Act, etc., etc. I mean, in a very short order, but very well written order, Honorable High Court has given some light, some clarifications on the ticklish provisions also. So I would request the organizers to allow me to share my screen so that I can show my slide. Yeah, it is there. Permission is already granted. Nilesh Bhai is really fantastic in terms of his management skill. Yes. So though I have taken the slide from this slide number 15, but I will briefly touch upon some earlier slide also very quickly, because I think we have sufficient time. Firstly, I want to say that, as I said, that this Benami law has been, this Benami transaction have been happening in our country since ages. Not only because of the customary practices were like that, also because of the fact that even the ruling, the government allowed Benami transactions to happen. The then government, that is the British government who was ruling in our country at that time, which will be evident from reading of these few sections of Indian Trust Act, section 82, section 81, 84, 94, which says that of Indian Trust Act drafted in 1882, which say that a person can do Benami transaction, meaning thereby a person can buy property in the name of another person and the right of the real owner will be protected. I mean, you may not believe it, but you can read please this section 82, etc. Section, I can read it, one of the sections before you. Where a property is transferred to one person from consideration paid or provided by another person, and it appears that such person did not intend to pay or provide such consideration for the benefit of the transferee must hold the property for the benefit of the person paying or providing the consideration. Similarly, you can see section 81. Similarly, you can see section 94. So this law was there, section 66 of CPC. Then our own Indian Income Tax Act also allowed this, section 281A, which says that a person can do Benami transaction without any problem. The only requirement is that that person should inform to the Chief Commissioner or Commissioner of his jurisdictional area that he has done this Benami transaction and he has bought this property in the name of the so-and-so person. That's all. The moment this requirement is fulfilled, there is no punishment, no acquisition, no attachment, no prosecution, nothing. So then you must be wondering that then where is this law? What happened suddenly? Because friends, this, whatever I have read so far, all these pieces of legislation, they were repealed in 1988 when through an ordinance, the original Benami law was brought out in our country in the name of Benami Transaction Prohibition Act 1988. And this section 1(3) read, provisions of section 3, 5 and 8 shall come into force at once. and the remaining provisions of this act shall be deemed to have come into force on the 19th May 1988. This section 1.3 is creating the entire controversy today, because in new law, which has been now reinforced with effect from 1/11/2016, this section has been kept as it is. Since it has been kept as it is, so one of the interpretation which is being made by some of the officers of the enforcement agency, namely BPU, Benami Prohibition Unit, is that this act is applicable, sir, since 19th May 1988 and latest by September 1988. So therefore, it is retrospective. So then Benami law at that time was defined very crisply. Benami transaction means any transaction in which property is transferred to one person for a consideration paid or provided by another person. So this is apparently incomplete definition. That is why probably it was not enforced, and that is why probably it could not be implemented. No enforcement agency was created, and that is why now probably this section has been completely replaced by new sections, completely overhauled. And then punishment was also prescribed, penalty was also prescribed. It was also mentioned this is provisions are known, bailable, etc. Then with effect from 1/11/2016, this new legislation has been brought out. I mean, this amendment act has been introduced, whereby some of the sections have been changed, some of the sections have been kept as it is, and some of the new sections have been brought out. Earlier there were 9 sections, now there are around 72 sections. So this is now like inserting a large ship into a small boat. But there was a sound reasoning behind it, as was explained by the then Finance Minister, late Shri Arun Jaitley, wherein during the course of the speech, he mentioned at the floor of the House, that is Parliament, Lok Sabha, he said that this has been brought out for a purpose in this manner, because we did not want to give immunity to the people who have done Benami transaction in last 28 years. 28 means 2016 minus 1988. So meaning thereby, as far as the verbal intention is concerned, it was conveyed through the speech that it will be applicable from retrospective effect. But let us finally analyze this aspect also, whether it is retrospective or not, as far as the reading of the law is concerned, as far as the bare provisions are concerned. So friends, Benami transaction, as you know, what is Benami transaction? It has been defined in section 2(9) of the PBPT Act 1988. Part A, Part B, Part C, and Part D. There are 4 parts in this section, and the parts are so sweeping, so omnibus, that all real life situations, whatever you can imagine, they have been covered here. Now, Part A says a transaction or arrangement. This is the most classic part of the definition clause of Benami transaction. It's a transaction or arrangement. Kindly see, the beginning itself is quite sweeping. It is not confining to mere word transaction. It is also adding another expression, that is arrangement. Lest a person says, I have not done any transaction, and so would immediately come the reply, oh, you did not do any transaction, but you have done some arrangement. So you can't escape. Please read further. Where a property is transferred to, comma, or is held by, comma, a person, comma, and the consideration for such property has been provided, comma, or paid by, comma, another person, comma. Now kindly see how many commas are there. And here the game is of comma only, magic is of comma only. Where a property is transferred to. Now, even if we presume that this law is prospective, suppose section 1(3) is held to be, absurd by Honorable Constitutional Court, say Honorable Bombay High Court, Delhi High Court, or Honorable Supreme Court. They say, no, let us read it prospective. We will not read section 1(3). 1(3) cannot be read qua new provisions. So 1(3) can be read qua old provisions only. Even if we remove section 1(3) from the picture, whether still there is anything which can hold it which can hold it retrospective. For that, let us analyze the bare provisions. So let us presume that it is prospective for a moment, where a property is transferred to. So that means the date of transfer should be post 1/11/2016. Only the new provisions can be applied. All right. Or is held by. Should be held when the notice is being issued. That is post 1/11/2016 only. But held since when? Now here comes the catch. Held since when is not given. So meaning thereby, one of the interpretation which some of the officers are making, that even if it is held even prior to that, even the property is held today, it can be treated as Benami, because it is a continuing offense. And one of the judgments, one of the orders passed by one of the additional session judges here in Delhi, it is pertaining to the prosecution under PBPT Act, has also held on the similar lines that this is a continuing offense. The view has been taken, this is a continuing offense. So meaning thereby, even if the property is held today, I mean, it can be roped in within the clutches of Benami law if it fits into the definition as given now under part A, B, C, or D, in whatever manner, in whatever part. So if it is held today, it can be roped in. If it is already sold before 1/11/2016, then what will happen? That is another debate. But if it is held today, vociferously, they are enforcing the case and making attachment lock, stock, and barrel. Now, remaining part says, and the consideration for such property has been provided or paid by another person. So consideration should also be paid or provided by another person, meaning thereby there is a person A, the property is transferred in the name of B, consideration is paid by Mr. A, property is transferred in the name of B, and property is, other condition is and, there is some and in between, and which means that other condition is to be read in conjunction with part A, which reads that the property is held for the immediate or future benefit, direct or indirect, of the person who has provided the consideration. Meaning thereby, property acquired by Mr. B on the basis of consideration paid by Mr. A, and Mr. B is holding the property for the benefit of Mr. A, then this part A of 29A says that it will be treated as Benami. So what is to be kept here in mind is that both the conditions should be fulfilled. If only one condition is fulfilled, it will not be Benami, because there is a word and in between. Now there are certain exceptions, 5 exceptions. If a case falls under part A and does not fall under exception, it will be Benami. There is no scope of any intention. There is no scope of any reason, bona fide or not. If it falls in any of the part in literal interpretation, it is Benami. Now let us read what are the exceptions. So only these 5 exceptions are the 5 rescue measures. Otherwise, there is no rescue in the entire act. Property held by Karta or member of HUF for his benefit or the benefit of other members in the family. Property held by a person standing in the fiduciary capacity for the benefit of another person and includes trustee, executor, partner, director of a company or depository. So if this fiduciary capacity clause is not there, was not there, I mean, hell would have broken its noose, because many innocuous cases would have been roped in then. Property held in the name of spouse or in the name of any child, it should be his or her spouse, not anybody's spouse. Because this question was asked from me in one of the gatherings. Any child up to any age will be a child. Property held as a joint owner in the name of brother, sister, lineal descendant or descendant. So if you are buying the property in the name of your mother for emotional reasons, hold on, it will be Benami unless you become the joint owner. If you are showing yourself the owner, you are not gifting it to the mother, kindly be the joint owner in the name of mother, father, brother, sister or grandchildren. Then last part is very important. Possession of any property taken or retained in part performance to a contract referred to in section 53 of the TPA. It is seeking to give benefit of immunity to power of attorney cases where property are transferred on power of attorney basis. But hold on, 2 conditions are attached. Conditions are very, very peculiar. That the stamp duty must have been paid and the contract of given power of attorney should have been registered. Why not registered? Whatever stamp duty was applicable, that should have been paid. So if these 2 conditions are fulfilled, normally sale deed is also executed. Mostly sale deed is not executed when both the conditions are not fulfilled. So what will happen to the power of attorney cases? I mean, I would only submit that God help us all, or some amendment should be brought out by the government. Now part B, C and D. Now these are the parts which are added now, which were not there in earlier 1988 Act. And each of these parts are very, very special, and we will definitely focus on part D lastly. Part A says a transaction or arrangement in respect of property carried out or made in a fictitious name. Yes, friends, the moment a property is found to be held in the name, a fictitious name, it is straight away Benami. The moment it is found in a fictitious name, for example, in the name of any goddess, god, any non-existing person, in the name of pets, etc., which is not recognized a person in the eyes of law, it is straight away Benami, nothing else to be proved. C, a transaction or arrangement in respect of property where the owner of the property is not aware of or denies the knowledge of such ownership. Quite often it happens that during the course of search, the lady of the house would say, shareholding? I do not have any shareholders. What shareholders are? Partner, I am not partner. What partnership ratio? Jewelry, I don't know. So if the ownership is defined, denied, part C says it will be Benami. Now one may argue as a fine lawyer that what will happen to the finer principles of Indian Evidence Act, which says, for example, section 91, 92, 101, 102, 103, that the documentary evidence shall precede over the oral evidences. Yes, you may be right, but the entire burden will be upon you in this case. And Khemkaji is there with us. Amit Khemkaji is a lawyer practicing before Honorable High Court and Supreme Court, specializing in prosecution matters. And I will seek his indulgence to throw some light on the applicability of principles of Indian Evidence Act, especially when a person has self-admitted that she or he does not know about the ownership. Then later on, to what extent, in what manner such kind of statement can be retracted, or without retracting it, how the documentary evidences can be provided and they can be made admissible. So that the rigors of Benami law are not applied upon such person in an unjustified manner. Leaving it that, friends, let me come to straight away to part D. Now, part D is a very classic part because it appears that it is going beyond the intention for which it has been enacted, because the income tax department is now using it as a tool for roping on those cases where the department has failed or even passed successful, wherever the additions have been made under section 68 or 69. I will explain it how. We will discuss it today. Part D says a transaction or arrangement in respect of a property where the person providing the consideration is not traceable or is fictitious. Now, we had an internal discussion at length on this, that whether this has been correctly worded or the provision is going even beyond the constitutional framework which we have, because it is saying a transaction arrangement in respect of property where the person providing the consideration. So there is a person B who is holding the property, and there is he says that the property, he is not aware about the property, that who has paid the consideration. Then this says is not traceable or fictitious, it is Benami, according to part D. Suppose Mr. B says that he is not aware of who has paid the consideration, where from it has come. So, it is apparently Benami. It could be quite justified, because a person who is having an asset, he is accountable to give explanation about its source of acquisition. But suppose the person says that, look, Mr. A has provided the consideration, and now, unfortunately, Mr. A is not traceable at the moment. Suppose he has taken sannyas, as Amit Khemkaji quite often quotes this example, because some of his friends who are very, very senior lawyer and very, very successful they have taken sannyas at an early age. After wearing black clothes, the black gown, the next color of the choice is orange only, maybe because of that reason, because there are many similarities between both the professions. The hard work, of course, is there in many professions, but the kind of dedication it requires, the selfless service it requires, you have to transcend beyond all the barriers. It is a divine function when you have to convince a person with your point of view, or you have to explain, or you have to help another person, that is honorable judge, to bring the truth on record. So maybe since it is close to the divine function, like that of a doctor, so that is why it happened. So whatever it is, so if that person has taken sannyas, or suppose he has gone abroad, he is not traceable on holidays, or he is hiding, or he is absconding, or he is underground, or he, for some reasons of insecurity, does not want to respond to the income tax department, and he becomes non-traceable, whether B can be held accountable for that. It could be understood if it is proved by the income tax department that Mr. A is fictitious, all right, non-traceable. So therefore, what we suggested to Honorable High Court, after making a lot of discussions and debate, that this word traceable is taking this clause beyond the constitutional framework. It is leading it to the absurdity, arbitrariness, and highly unjustified. So this traceable word should be ideally replaced with the word not identifiable. Not traceable should be replaced with the word not identifiable. If I am saying Mr. A and A is not identifiable, what A? Who A? His PAN number is not there, his ID card is not there, his address is not there. I mean, etc. Complete KYC is not there. So that means this is not traceable. This allegation can be made, not identifiable. But traceability, that may not be in my control. So that is how, friends, I mean, this clause G is really creating very, I mean, disastrous results. So this issue came up before Honorable Telangana High Court, Hyderabad, in the case of Jara Investment Private Limited, and the order has been very recent, dated 30th March 2021. The facts, the allegation was in section 24(1) and etc., that there is some investment or mutual fund etc. held by Zara in its balance sheet, for which payment was made by it, admittedly, that it is Benami under section 290. On the ground that Zara has used the funds for this investment which were received from two partnership firms, say P1 and P2, and who had in turn augmented these funds on account of advances received in cash from third parties, and which could not be substantiated. So third party could not confirm. So these cash amounts received by these firms could not be substantiated in their hands. Additions were made in the hands of the partnership firms. Now these partnership firms had given advances by check to Zara. Zara had, there was some mutual agreement between partnership firms and Zara. Some investment agreement was there, some loan syndication agreement was there. And in terms of that agreement, amounts of advances were given by these firms to Zara. And Zara in turn used these amounts received from these firms by way of check amount in acquiring these shares and mutual fund, etc. So since the cash amount was not properly explained in the hands of the firms, the additions were made by the AO in the hands of the firm. So therefore, a reference was made by the AO to the BPU, and BPU on the basis of such reference held that since these sources are not very well explained, so therefore these persons are not traceable, and since persons are not traceable, these firms are Benamidar, Zara is Benamidar, this funds, this shares is Benami property, and Mr. A, who was a major partner there in the firm and who is now major shareholder in Zara, is treated as beneficial owner. Now there are many, right and wrong things simultaneously mentioned and alleged by the department in these notices. So then this issues were raised. Writ was filed before Honorable Telangana High Court on the ground that section 29D was not reflected in the facts of the case, and also raised many other legal grounds. So when I argued before the Honorable High Court, one of the important arguments which came to our mind was that firstly, the stand of the department itself is self-contradictory. Firstly, for the reason that let us see what the section 29D is saying. I will take you back to section 29D for a moment. A transaction or arrangement in respect of a property where the person providing the consideration is not traceable or is fictitious. So meaning thereby there has to be one person, that is namely B, and B does not tell about anybody else. So either the anybody else is not traceable or is fictitious. So known existence of any other person is a mandatory condition, a mandatory situation, so as to allow the triggering of this section. Otherwise, this section itself will not trigger. So in case already another person exists, so that means it's traceable. So therefore, there cannot be a beneficial owner in this case. Whatever it is that B only. You may treat him as Benamidar, you may treat him as beneficial owner, whatever you may call it. He is the real owner. He is holding the property, and the person providing the consideration is not available. It is on presumptive deemed basis only this law has been created. So therefore, the moment, coming back to this judgment now, this order and the arguments now, the moment the department itself is saying that Mr. A is the beneficial owner, that Mr. A is identified, you may test under A if allowed, under clause A or any other clause if allowed, but not under D. D is not attracted at all. And similarly, many other arguments were made. For example, some of the arguments were like this, that Zara has made investment from his own bank account. Since Zara has made his own bank account, who is provided the consideration for this? Zara only. And Zara is saying, I have paid the consideration. So D comes into play only when I own the asset, B owns the asset, and B says somebody else has paid the consideration, or he is not aware of who has paid the consideration. If B says, no, I have paid the consideration of this from my own sources, there is no need to go to anybody else. So since in this case, Zara is saying that consideration has been paid by me, so there is no question of applying B. Third argument. Third argument is that in any case, these firms who has paid the amount are identified. Income tax assessees cannot be said to be non-traceable. Now, where from these firms have taken the money? It is firm's business, and it is for the department to see. I mean, it has got nothing to do with Benami law. So these three arguments were made, and luckily one more development took place, that in the appeal before CIT appeal, which were filed by these firms against the suspend order passed in their hands, wherein these additions were made, CIT appeal deleted those additions. Some additions were legal grounds, some additions were merits also. Okay, funds are duly explained. So that was the background. Then also some other arguments were raised, that proper reasons, recording of reasons, principles of natural justice, proper approval. I mean, they are all missing. 24(1), because there is one practice going on. Rather, I would say it is like a fashion going on in the Benami Provision Unit, that Benami Provision Unit officer says with proud that we are not supposed to provide copy of reasons to the notices. Meaning thereby, they are saying whether we have recorded the reasons or not, nobody can check. Whether the reasons are right or wrong, nobody can check. So neither recording of the reasons is to be shown by them, nor the providing of the reasons is there. So these were the also arguments that reasons have not been provided to us. And what kind of reasons are them, we do not know. So Honorable High Court analyzed entire, and we also prayed for that that provisional attachment order should be suspended, because it is beyond jurisdiction. Because in writ jurisdiction, relief can be given only when the lack of jurisdiction can be shown. Only when we can show that on the admitted facts as it is, whatever has been stated, still the allegation which has been made cannot be made, since the law is not applicable. And when we can show that there is a violation of some constitutional rights or violation of principles of natural justice. So all those things were argued. It was also argued, yes, that reminds me, it was argued that section Article 19(1)(g) and Article 300(a) of Constitution are also violated in the case, because it is my right to own the property, right to do business. My business assets are being attached. So both are hampered. So that is how prayer was made to seek the indulgence of the Honorable High Court. Now, in the interim order itself, so for the timing only interim order has been passed. In the interim order itself, detailed order has been passed, though not very detailed, brief, but reasoning is very, to the point. PO passed by the AO is suspended, and far-reaching observations have been made, which are of crucial importance for the interpretation of the various provisions of PBPT Act and appropriate manner of their enforcement by the initiating officers. So 29D के ऊपर भी है the decision, and also on the various legal aspects which should be kept in mind by the officers while implementing this law. So some of the important observations which I would like to discuss here, threadbare as it is, without adding or reducing anything from my side. Honorable High Court has said that in the present case, 29D is not applicable. 5 observations are important, which I would be sharing with you. So first observation is 29D is not applicable here. Honorable High Court has said that the transaction of investment in share is sought to be classified as falling under 29D. The litmus test to be applied for characterizing the said transaction to be covered by subclause D of section 2(9) of PBPT Act is that the person providing the consideration should be not traceable or fictitious. In the facts of the case, admittedly, the petitioner has provided the consideration for the transaction, and it cannot be said to be either fictitious or not traceable, being a legal entity. Thus, the provision does not apply to the petitioner. Even assuming the scope of the test to be applied is expanded to cover the transaction received by the petitioner for being invested. Now they have gone one step ahead. Let us apply it. The transaction investment in Nippon Fund has been made by the petitioner from the investment it received from the 4th and 5th respondents through banking channels, duly disclosed by the petitioner in its books, apart from the 4th and 5th respondents being also traceable and non-fictitious. 4th and 5th respondents were those firms, P1 and P2. So they are saying they're traceable, non-fictitious. So even from that ground also, I mean, this 29D cannot be applied. Then lastly, this clarification was also given on which we are also further deliberating in-house, that I mean, what kind of implications can be made from these observations. Though it is sought to be contended by the revenue that there have been cash deposits into the account of these firms, which remain unexplained, and said amounts found their way to the petitioner company through layers, attracting the provisions of Section 29D of the PBPT Act, we are prima facie unable to agree with it. In our prima facie opinion, the scope and ambit of PBPT Act appears to be to cover only direct transactions and arrangement where the immediate persons providing consideration is not traceable or fictitious. But it does not appear to be intended to apply to a case where multiple layers are involved, because according to Honorable High Court, what has to be seen is the immediate transaction. For as far as Benami is concerned, for the purpose of income tax, one may examine immediate layers and all that, ultimate layers and all that. This would be evident from the statement of objects and reasons of enactment implemented by accepting the recommendation made by the 57th report of Law Commission submitted in August 1973. The recommendation of the Law Commission would also reveal that what was sought to be addressed by the enactment is where the property is transferred Benami, the Benamidar will become the real owner. So this was first major observation. Then the second observation of Honorable High Court is that independent inquiry satisfaction reason to believe on the part of IU are mandatory before initiation of proceedings under PBPT Act. The observations are, from the above, it is clear that the initiation of the proceedings by the second respondent is on the basis of search operations carried out by the income tax authorities, and the information is forwarded by the said office. Thus, there is no independent inquiry undertaken by the second respondent authority to record its satisfaction or for having a reason to believe that the petitioner is a Benamidar and the sixth respondent is a beneficiary. The sixth respondent means the Mr. A, who was common partner and shareholder, and second respondent is the IO. So, and the sixth respondent is the beneficiary of the Benami property with regard to investment in so and so asset, for the same being liable to be attached under Section 24(3) of the PBPT Act. Now, surprisingly, despite categorically allegation from the petitioner, I do not know why the department did not submit the copy of the reasons, but Honorable High Court gathered it from the facts brought before it, and the allegations made in the 24(1) notice that the IO has simply cut and paste the reference, the information received, and acted upon it. Whereas the IO's duty was that it should have made inquiry, made its own analysis, and then reached out its independent conclusion, and then recorded a reason to believe that this property is Benami because of so and so reason, applying the provisions correctly. And similarly, there was a compulsion, a mandatory requirement on the approving authority also to independently record his satisfaction also. Then third basis was adopted by the Honorable High Court was the CITA deleted the additions made in the hands of forms P1 and P2. So edifice has gone. It says, since the impugned show cause notice issued under Section 24(1) of the Act is on the basis of proceeding initiated by the income tax authorities against fourth and fifth respondent in relation to cash deposits made being treated as from unexplained sources, the addition of such cash deposits has now been deleted by the appellate authority. Prima facie, the transaction of investment by the said respondents in the petition company would have treated as genuine. If the said investment is treated as prima facie genuine and duly accounted for, the same cannot be treated as Benami in the hands of the petitioner company, as the person providing the consideration for the transaction arrangement are traceable and not fictitious. So for this reason also, I mean, the whole edifice goes. But despite that, the department is continuing with the case. Then lastly, but not least, I mean, Honorable High Court says that in the given circumstances, prima facie, the action of second respondent, that is the IO, in continuing the provisional attachment of the petitioner's investment in so and so asset would be a clear transgression of fundamental right enshrined in Article 19(1)(g) and Article 300(a) of the Constitution. So if law is not adhered to properly, then it gives rise to violation of fundamental or constitutional rights. And therefore it was held that the provisional attachment under section issued by IU cannot be sustained, and that is why it was suspended. So we can have a detailed argument, detailed discussion, detailed deliberation on this act of various provisions, but today we have the benefit of presence of Shri Amit Khemka ji, with whom I think we can discuss some other nitty-gritties and also final principles of prosecution, because I have heard in Bombay also many notices with regard to prosecution have been issued, and for which people are not able to understand how to respond. So I think all those things Nilesh Bhai told me that many queries arising on fundamental issues have come up before the organizers, Nilesh Bhai and Kinjal Saab and Shankar ji. So I think you can raise all those issues as may be applicable to me or to Khemka ji or to Dr. Gupta, so that with a process of mutual learning can take place. So I can see the galaxy of very senior professionals, and believe me, it is a matter of mutual learning only. And I am privileged to be part of you. It reminds me the golden moments of 2 years, 2015 to 2017, which I spent between all of you. Thank you very much.